Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. In the next episode, we have design engineer Jude Pullen, who has worked at companies including Lego and Dyson. Join us to hear what makes Jude compare his work to being chef.
Okay.
Hello, Jude. So today we've got Jude Pullen with us. Now, we're very lucky because Jude's a multi-award winning product designer, engineer, and creative technologist. And that sounds exciting, so we'll go into that. And Jude, you've worked with some of the world's best known design teams, including the teams at Dyson and Lego, and they really are household names that we're all familiar with. And I kind of want to break that down a bit before we go into the work. I want to know about the problems that you're solving for these companies, and how you go about it.
Yeah, I think the phrase or the job title of creative technologist seems to be a reasonably new one. And indeed, I slightly was inspired by a technologist I met, and she had this wonderful route into her career of actually starting off as a cleaner, I believe, in a basically media agency company, and worked her way all the way up to the top to be a director. And she always sort of just described it as very much having a sort of unique perception of technology, but also on the sort of familiar and everyday sort of things that surround our lives. And so I think the thing I really enjoyed about that, and I think the way I've internalized that, is to sort of say that I either look at the cutting edge technology that's out there and try and simplify it so that companies can understand how to sort of, as it were, operate with it. Or indeed, I think this is nothing new. I can't take credit for it because I think companies like Nintendo do it all the time very well, which is take something that you think you've got very familiar with, but give it a really fresh twist. So I sort of tend to sort of use those techniques very frequently, but of course, I think it's fair to say there's a little bit more to it than that as well, and I guess we'll get into that as we progress.
Well, indeed, I love that, a fresh twist. It's so easily said. I don't suppose it's as easily achieved necessarily overnight. Now you've done a bit of telework as well, haven't you? You were on the BBC's Big Life Fix,
Yeah.
and on the Great British Inventions program, which is on Channel 4. What tell us a bit more about those programs, how you were involved, and what it was like being a part of them. I mean, from the point of view of the responsibility, I suppose, being one of not particularly many people who represent science to the wider world.
Yeah. Well, I think it was one of those, funny things of I guess, to sort of give a little bit of context. I ended up growing up in the country and not really knowing what a designer was. And so consequently, as you know, having met me at Sugru, I ended up being a chemist. And the funny thing was, I really loved that insight into the atomic and how things work. But if you sort of call that the micro scale, I was also really fascinated by the macro scale. And so, long story short, ended up quitting my day job at a horticultural specialist, which of course wasn't particularly relevant to my degree in chemistry, and retraining in product design engineering at Glasgow after seeing a TV show called Better by Design. And so it was quite strange to have gone for all of this sort of, career at Dyson and things like this and Sugru, and then realized I was in the fortunate position of helping make a TV show, which at the time I was just hanging on by the seat of my pants, really, because it was a bit of a whirlwind experience. But now, having sort of spoken to so many students and indeed teachers, you can't help but realize it is the same sort of inspiration that it was to me seeing Seymour and Powell when they were sort of designing. So, of course, the emphasis has changed slightly, but that fascination with helping people through design, I think, is the thread that connects all of those sort of genre, if you can call it that, of programs together. And yeah, I'm very proud to be one of the 8 designers that took part in that.
It is a great achievement to be whittled down. So when we're talking about redesigning things that already exist, can you do that for any company? Does it have to be anything significant?
This,
Literally anything, can it be a water bottle or a printer, or what's the range?
yeah, I'm worried some people are now going to sort of almost like hit the pause button and give up on this if I say, yes, I genuinely believe I could work, or indeed any designer in theory could work in any company at all. And that's not because I have a sort of overinflated sense of capability. It's that I genuinely believe in the design process, the methodology that we're taught, which is basically to deconstruct things, but then to sort of dig around in the uncomfortable questions that is the sort of the human story within the technology, and then basically reassemble things such that they make more sense. And often I try not to sort of go in as any sort of design sort of guru or shaman, and rather someone who is just good at bridging different departments within a company, and indeed different disciplines. One of the sort of strangest things is that I'm not sort of short on, shall we say, job offers from companies saying come work full time. And it's always a weird, slightly awkward conversation, because the irony is I love working with lots of different companies, and I think that's actually what makes me, as it were, effective and impactful, is bringing all that. Obviously I don't breach confidentiality or anything like this, but if I've, say, just worked on a medical device, then suddenly working on a project for children, it might be that I realize, hang on a minute, there's a scaled down version of this technology which I wouldn't have even dreamt had been relevant until I just jumped into this new world. And so for me, it's the fact that really people think that all industries are very, very different. And of course they are in a nuanced level, but actually we're all living in the same time, we're all part of very similar generations. And so actually there is a shared aspiration between so many companies that are all sort of pushing forward in now 2023, 2024. And so that's the thing I really love. It is just applying the process of design to different companies with different teams. And that for me is the most exciting bit. Is, I don't go in there as a sort of Paul Rand and say, this is it, this is the design you have paid for. Be confident that it's reassuringly expensive. I genuinely love doing things from the ground up with the team, and sharing that pride and indeed the fear, the adrenaline rush that comes with, is it going to work? That for me is, what makes being a designer, I think, one of the most exciting jobs in the world.
It's so nice to hear you be so enthusiastic about it. I suppose from a practical point of view as well, if you're in a company, you don't necessarily see what's constantly in front of you. Whereas if you're fresh in and in for a shorter period of time, then you get the benefit of the perspective. And I wonder if you mentioned adrenaline. A lot of people, that adrenaline effectively comes from uncertainty, and I think a lot of people fear uncertainty rather than seek it.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it is about you that makes you seek it and understand how to handle it and operate under that kind of pressure.
Yeah, and I think, I don't want to sort of give any impression that I'm sort of trying to pass myself off as a sort of Elon Musk wannabe. It's not a adrenaline seeking from, being sort of braggadocious or, very extreme in things. Quite often what I'm doing, I think, is for a company might be high risk, but it's still very calculated. It's premeditated. As you could say, we've done our homework on the risk that we're trying to put forward as a rational proposition. And sometimes, often, I come at it from the other direction, to be honest, which is that I sort of amongst friends and peers, I think that we'd probably say we find the fear in a company. And fear can be the uncertainty, as you sort of pointed out. And at the minute, that feels like, AI, machine learning, data privacy, sustainability, even diversity and inclusion. It doesn't mean that a company is racist, but a lot of companies haven't figured out how to not just grudgingly have more women or more people of color in positions of power, but actually see this as like the intellectual acumen and the future proofing of a company. So I think it's about changing people's mindsets and de-risking their fear towards doing something that they are very unfamiliar with, and doing that in a way that is empathetic and sensitive. And I choose empathetic rather than sympathetic. There's an important distinction there. I don't have to disagree or agree, but it's understanding their inner narrative and then trying to sort of create a safe place so that we can work on some of the thornier issues, and build trust and build confidence. So for me, it's funny. I get hired because of the technology and all the sort of engineering chops and letters after my name, but really I feel most of what preoccupies me is the human questions.
That's fantastic, because that's what it all boils down to, really. When you think of anything, in fact, it's all about people. And so many times things are categorized and labeled and all the rest of it, and the constant through it all is people. So it's very
absolutely.
So that let's so you come up with a new thing, a new invention, and then you have to do patent citing. How does that work? You want to make sure that nobody else can copy it, or you want to protect it for a certain period of time?
Yeah, I think I've spent so long in and out of patents that I think maybe I have a bit of an unorthodox opinion of it. Of even my final year project, I patented a medical device, and it was sort of a strangely, sort of a bit of a sort of baptism of fire, because you realize you are, trying to protect something so that the financial investment can be recouped by the company that hopes to acquire it. At the same time, the actual real goal of a patent is to give it back to society, to the world, after 20, 21 years. And so it's a sort of weird sort of ethical dilemma. And I think there's times where I think some companies can learn and profit as much from sometimes a careful strategy around even things like open source. And I don't think it always has to be one of monopolizing a thing in order to get ahead. And, case in point, this could be as sort of playful and fun as Arduino making a little mini computer for anyone who doesn't know, for prototyping available. But it could be as heavyweight as, Tesla making its battery technology. And that isn't necessarily just through the lens of Elon Musk being altruistic. It's that he wants a rising tide to lift all boats. If his preferred method of charging batteries is accepted wholesale, that means his company benefits from that rollout as well. So I think if I've learned anything from working with some terrific patent attorneys, is that it's not about hoarding nuts like a squirrel. It's about being really strategic and getting way ahead 20 years into the future minimum of your thinking of a company's innovation pipeline. And I absolutely love the amount of times I've been in a patent meeting, and we think that we're, let's say, I'm just looking at my fruit bowl here, but let's say we're trying to patent an orange, and then you realize you could also make orange juice. And that moment where suddenly you've deconstructed, as I've said with this word, which I enjoy, and realize that there's an entirely new way to engage with something, as we're eating an orange versus juicing an orange. And I think that sort of thing is really powerful in the company. And I think that's when companies go, right, I get it. That's what rockstar creativity looks like, is when they see that paradigm shift within their own range of capabilities, products, or services suddenly take a leap into the unknown. But it makes total sense that would be a good idea. That, I mean, you just can't beat it. That feeling of being part of a team when that moment strikes after doing all the homework is just the best.
You make it sound very appealing.
Making orange juice.
Yeah. Suddenly thirsty. So I mean, To me at least, you seem so ahead of the curve. You're practically drawing the curve for us. Never mind being ahead of it, you're paving the way effectively. And I just wondered, how, given your advanced natural way of thinking, and critical, overly overcritical, more so than most people perhaps, how you feel about artificial intelligence entering the mainstream, and what kind of impact or benefit you feel, what impact, negative or
Yeah,
positive.
I can sense you're not trying to lead the question there, but yeah, I think being a technologist, you become acutely aware if you've done any homework on any sort of technology at all, that these things are always complicated. One of the examples I use to sort of, should we say, soften people up to the notion that this is not so simple is most people, appreciate that their phone has something called an accelerometer in it. And even if they don't know it by that term, they know that if they wiggle it around, it has an ability to sense that, and that is an accelerometer. That device wasn't created for phones, it was created to guide missiles. And that technology started off being millions of pounds worth of tech. And of course, now it's, pennies to buy a sort of 9 degree of freedom accelerometer. So it's kind of insane how the technology has, morphed into not just being cheaper, but also ubiquitous to the point of it's applied in things that were never conceived by its, originators of the technology. And so when I look at AI, I think there's it's basically impossible to predict that missile to smartphone application. But what you can predict, because I don't think we've really changed over this the millennia, is I think it comes down to ethics. Is how do you manage our ethical relationship? And I do find it sometimes frustrating that, for example, I guess I'm going to name names. 23andMe was a company I was absolutely raring to send off my DNA and get all this fabulous data about my health. And I am one of the people who reads small print. And I just realized that it said, not even in particularly legalese, obfuscated sort of writing, it just made it very clear that they were at liberty to sell the data to third parties in any way, shape, or form in perpetuity forever. And I just thought, and it had the audacity to charge me $100 to do it as well. And so I just felt like that was a real wake up call for me, that a really exciting startup whose founder, of course, was intellectually charismatic and all these great things you expect. But I just found that was completely unforgivable, that was so buried. Had it been declared up front, I feel I would have reacted differently. But I think in some ways that was, dare I say it, I'm glad I got the, once bitten, twice shy effect. And I'm certainly much more circumspect when installing apps or various things which I know are trying to make a quick hustle. And I think there's a great illustration of two pigs in a barn, and one pig says to the other, "It's brilliant here, isn't it? There's food and all the meals are free and it's warm and it's heated." And underneath it's got this caption of, "If you're not paying for it, you are the product." And I think that in the sort of tech world is a really important litmus test. But as I just mentioned with 23andMe, even when you are paying for it, sometimes you still are the product. And I think when it comes back to your original question of AI, I still would categorize myself as a sort of tech optimist. And I do think the more I look back into history, the more I think essentially the best of humanity does prevail. But the sobering part is there are always very bitter, tragic casualties that go along these things. And that doesn't mean that I'm letting technologists off the hook. I think it's more just saying, I think that's how we as consumers should try to align ourselves with the brands that actually manage these interactions in the most transparent way. I'm not advocating for a nanny state. My advocation is transparency, is don't try and hoodwink people. If you're gonna sell their genetic data, tell them up front. It would be the case in point for that, how to do it differently.
So it's a question of people saying what they're actually using this AI for, being very honest about it, and us being responsible enough to bother to read the T's and C's and make a decision based on what we find.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I think it's a really complicated one of where does the government have a duty to step in and protect people who, let's call it what it is, haven't had the same privilege or education or upbringing that you and I have, Harriet. They might not be so easily predisposed or confident to navigate the legal T's and C's of things. And I don't think it's I don't think it's great if a society just says, well, more fool you. You clicked on it, it's your fault. I do think we don't apply that uniformly across all levels of society, be it age or any other disposition. And so I think we should still have guidance and a degree of protection to an extent, but I think it's almost a little bit like advertising standards, right? You should make it so that the average layperson does not purchase and then realize they made a mistake. They should at least know, yeah, I knew full well. I mean, it's kind of like going to a casino and you know that the house wins, right? Even the dumbest gambler knows the house wins, right? I mean, look around all the gold and opulence. Like, who do you think is losing here? But yes, I think, do people, to use that analogy, do people need some sort of guide rails and help to make sure that people aren't just taken advantage of and it destroys lives? I do think that's where the move fast, break stuff mantra of Silicon Valley, and indeed many other tech sectors, does need some guide rails, because it's not cool to just be quite that cavalier with people's lives and indeed their futures. Really.
Quite agree. So
Sorry,
now,
long answer on that one, but it could have been 10 times longer. Having been a tech scout for Lego, I can assure you most of the work was ethics. So I actually find it quite strange, as I don't know, I can't speak for my design course these days, but I certainly feel it's an interesting provocation that doctors are taught ethics. I don't know why designers aren't and engineers aren't. Like, a formal course in how to navigate an ethically fraught situation, I think would be invaluable to any course tutors listening. Please integrate it.
I agree. I think it's a hot topic. I think New York Times share moral dilemmas quite often. That it's does seem to be something that people are struggling with, or exploiting. You don't know which one always. So it's almost addictive talking to you. I want to ask you about what you think about everything. But I just want to go back, just to get a bit of a picture of how it all began. Because you did chemistry, but before chemistry, you were, a sort of not normal child at school.
Yeah, country bumpkin, as they say.
What made you, what happened at school that made you end up in chemistry? And then and also, what were you like at school? Were you
Yeah, bit of a misfit, unsurprisingly. I mean, I'm not going to get the violin out too much, but being called Jude the days before Jude Law, and having curly hair, and my mom being half Nigerian in a very, very white sort of rural town, does not does not make you blend in. Let's just put it that way. At the same time, I was really fortunate. My parents had a stable marriage, very loving, very secure. So there's lots of great things going for me. And I think, them both coming from an arts background supported that creativity, even if they rather unfortunately didn't find immediate careers in arts and ended up being entrepreneurial and setting up a children's nursery. And I think that had a consequential effect on me, that I was, not through them being cynical, but of course I was just aware that the realities of getting a profession in arts was very difficult. So even though I was busy enjoying sciences, but also, doing ceramics in my lunch break, at A levels, I didn't really believe that I could get an artistic career. And it sounds silly in hindsight, in the days of, Johnny Ive and people like this and Dieter Rams being household names, but I genuinely didn't know design was a career that was open to me. And that's why I opted for, well, I better do, it's a bit like they said, you should do a trade. I was like, science is a good, solid trade. I'll at least be able to pay my way in life. But really, it's been a fight to get back to redress that balance and have something, without sounding too pretentious, but a bit more Renaissance, a bit more of a sort of broader canvas on which to work, where there is not a hard line between the art and the science, or the technology and the humanity.
Mm-hmm. You're here with me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on your favourite podcast platform. I'm surprised you didn't have any teachers that might have guided you and explained design and crossover.
Yeah, it's difficult. I had a pretty, he wouldn't mind me saying, pretty screwball mad professor, D&T teacher, and I think he really was an inspiration on me. But I wouldn't say, through no fault of his own, it would be hard looking back to give me the right careers advice. I don't think I was particularly stable or knew what I was doing. I mean, who does in their teens, right? But yeah, I'm certainly not putting the accusation on like he failed me or anything. He was a terrific guy, and I spent many a lunch hour just disassembling things like TVs and stuff like that, and just learning. So I think he really instilled a sort of confidence in, self-discovery and learning how to learn, really. And so even though I wouldn't say he was a very structured mentor, I think actually being comfortable with a lack of structure is weirdly what I draw on heavily in my work, because guess what? When you're deliberately taking projects which don't have a playbook or are in the vanguard, you can't really rely on a PhD. That's kind of the point. You are by definition in the unknown, and that's the thrill of it.
So in some ways you were that inquisitive child, and you had the space to do that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I remember, but it's also something I think is maybe a little bit under acknowledged, in that, my parents both worked, and there was a little bit of they certainly weren't, Victorian, or sort of children should be seen and not heard, but there was a little bit of a 3 strikes and you're out. Of, if I said I was bored, my mom or dad would be like, well, you could do this. And if I was like, nah, and we could do that, and it's like, nah, and then they're like, well, you're on your own. It's like the third one was like, all right, you figure it out. And I think that's kind of a good training, really, for being in the creative industry, because you can go to an inspirational event, you can read an inspirational book, but after a certain point you're going to have to generate the ideas yourself out of thin air, and that stimulus does play a part, whatever it is that the subconscious does. But it is also that resilience and confidence that, I'm perhaps, to someone listening in their early career, think, oh yeah, Jude's got it all figured out, he sounds very confident and can do this. And yeah, but it's like 20 years I've been doing this. So, you speak to an athlete, who's been doing it for 20 years. Of course, they're going to outrun you, outthrow you, whatever. And I kind of think it's a little bit like a sort of creative gym. I've just been benching pretty hard for a lot of years. But that doesn't mean I'm made of anything superhuman. It's basic stuff and basic techniques, and just again, unlike maybe the gym, it's not a macho grind. I genuinely love being curious. I feel like the biggest secret to the design profession is somehow I'm getting paid to be curious, which feels like the most childlike indulgence. But the difference is, unlike the Picasso saying of the inner child, is the difference is I'm bringing engineering rigor and business acumen to bear on top of the childlike mad professor hair, persona. So it's trying to marry the two poles, really. That's the work, really.
I think you do it very well, and I think you do it with beautiful humility. Now, just to finish off, and I don't really want to finish because I'm sure, well, maybe we'll have to talk again. I think it would be interesting to know what your dream future might look like. I don't know if that could be a dream project or whatever it might be. Your
Yeah,
fantasy. Yeah. No humility involved.
yeah, I don't know. It's tricky because I find that often I work on sort of, I mean, I'm hired as sort of a futurist in projects, and I've done stuff for sort of big agencies and some household names, and that's very exciting. But really, the underlying thing of that is the humility to realize you could create the future in your own head and produce a little widget, and you can put it out into the blogosphere or the social media, and yes, it can go viral, and you can amazingly seem to sort of put a little dent in people's consciousness that maybe something should exist. At the same time, you can work with a company like Lego or IKEA or any of these sorts of big players where even doing a very small thing, you're impacting colossal sales, revenues, production units per whatever. And so for me, it's the enjoyment I find is going in and this is going to sound an absolutely terrible analogy, but it's almost like being a chef and looking in a fridge and going, we got some interesting ingredients here. What are we going to cook that's going to taste good? And I think that is the futurism, but unlike a omnipotent, chef, it's a team. And actually, having worked in some kitchens, actually kitchens really are a team effort as well. So even that sort of lone myth of the Gordon Ramsays as these screaming tyrants, I think a lot of that's theater, and there's actually a huge amount of esprit de corps, and when the cameras aren't rolling, you've got to have the love, and you've got to have the humility and the compassion and the being able to see something in someone else that maybe even they don't see themselves. I feel that's one of the most, I mean, that's the stuff you really keep in touch with people for years, is because you discover something quite intimate and quite surprising about each other, and unlock people's potential, and indeed within yourself. I mean, having done Big Life Fix, yes, I was hired as a designer, but that was so much of a two-way interaction with all of the people I worked with. It was never a sort of strutting around as the superstar designer. The joy for all of us was it was a collaboration, and we were often as left with our heads spinning with the experience as much as the people were of our supposed design chops, and skills. But we were sort of so invested in their journey that it was a two-way thing. And I think for me that's the thing. Even in sometimes the most unlikely of companies, it's still, as up in Edinburgh at a scanning electron microscope company, and again, you would think that was the most detailed scientific thing, but so much of our discussion was about human interactions and perception, and what does this mean? So yeah, I absolutely love these sorts of things, and I think that's sometimes the misconception of the being a technologist is it's really about the story and the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And the human side of what that means for us to live with that technology. And I think, to maybe finally answer your question, it is a sense of you're creating the future rather than crystal balling it. And I think that is the thrill, is that you have to sort of ask those big questions of what if, because you might inadvertently start to create something that influences a lot of things, and that's really the thrill.
Mm-hmm. Well, you certainly inspire me, Jude. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure having you here, and hopefully we'll speak again before long.
Absolutely. I look forward to that.